Crowds of Americans and other foreigners lined up at installations around Saigon waiting for buses was the cue. It told the Vietnamese that this was the end of the line. For most of those who wanted to leave their country, this would be their last chance. Some Americans who pushed towards the bus tried to pull their Vietnamese wives and children along with them. There were desperate scenes with families separated and crying out for help, pleading not to be left behind, clutching at the last straw of hope. We rode through the streets of Saigon for more than 4 hours, unable to find a way out or anyone who could tell us where to go. At Tan Son Nhut Airport, armed paratroopers turned our buses back. At one point, we were unloaded on the Saigon waterfront, where we could see American helicopters circling the city, and Vietnamese trying to escape on boats heading to the sea. No one wanted to be left in this crowd that at times was strangely quiet, but that always was on the verge of panic. We all decided to try and reach the United States Embassy, and once there, we found it surrounded by Vietnamese looking for a way in and a way out. Helicopters were landing on the roof and inside the compound as we walked to the back of the embassy. We had to push and shove our way through a crowd of several hundred Vietnamese trying to scale the walls, only to be knocked back by U.S. Marines. Once inside the compound, for the Americans and those Vietnamese who managed to get in with legal documents, and the many who managed entrance without, the rest was easy. It was just a matter of waiting your turn for a helicopter to take you to one of the ships on station off the Vietnamese coast. The American fleet had been having problems since the start of the evacuation, not with the arrival of South Vietnamese pilots and their helicopters loaded with family and friends. Hovering above the decks to unload their passengers, the pilots were unfamiliar with landing their craft on a moving ship. One crashed into the side of the USS Blue Ridge. Others managed to crash land on the deck of the ship. For those that did manage to put down, they were simply pushed over the side and into the sea by U.S. sailors and Marines to make room for the returning American craft based on that ship, filled with evacuees from Saigon. Other South Vietnamese pilots just hovered long enough to unload their passengers and then headed to the side of the ships and just jumped out with their life vests to be picked up by U.S. sailors, their helicopters crashing into the sea. Still other pilots headed out to the side of the ships after unloading their passengers and settled the craft into the water and then jumped out, again waiting to be picked up by U.S. sailors. Many hours later, as one of the last evacuees arrived, U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin, the final American ambassador stationed in South Vietnam. After so many long and bitter years, the American involvement in Vietnam was over. Ed Bradley, CBS News, Manila.
The United States evacuation flights from Vietnam are over now, of course. And one of those aboard one of the last flights was our own Ed Bradley of CBS News. He arrived in the Philippines today, and he's standing by in a studio there in Manila. Ed, this is Hughes Rudd in New York. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you, Hughes.
Well, first of all, your mother says to tell you that she's fine, but the real question is, how are you and how was it getting out?
Well, it was pretty chaotic, Hughes. We spent about 5.5 hours riding around the city of Saigon looking for a way out. The evacuation plan had been set up. It seemed to be a pretty good plan. We had mimeographed reports of what we were supposed to do, where we were supposed to go. But when we went to the first evacuation point, there was no one there. None of the embassy personnel to tell us what happens next. So we moved to the second point, and again found there was no one there. So instead of moving to still another point, we decided that we should remain there, put everyone in the building, and wait for someone to show up. After about a half an hour or so, an American Army captain showed up with 2 buses. We loaded some of the people on. They were supposed to seat about 40 or 50 people. We put 75, 80 people on a bus and shipped them out to Tan Son Nhut Airport. Those first buses that went out had no problems at all. They drove right out to Tan Son Nhut, right into the gates, went into the Defense Attaché office complex there, waited for the helicopters, boarded the helicopters, and left South Vietnam. we could hear over the military, or rather the embassy radio, that buses that left later had problems. There was a lot of shooting. Buses were fired upon by South Vietnamese soldiers. When they reached Tan Son Nhut Airport, there was incoming rocket and artillery fire from the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. The helicopters, when they took off, received ground fire. And it's believed that the ground fire came from both sides, that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were firing, and also that some of the angry South Vietnamese soldiers on Tan Son Nhut Air Base were also firing at the American helicopters. With the bus that I was on for the evacuation, we went to Tan Son Nhut Airport, and the armed South Vietnamese paratroopers refused to let us in. We spent an hour there going from one gate to another. We tried 4 different times, and they just refused to let us in. And the fallback plan was supposed to be that you go to the embassy, but apparently our driver, who, by the way, wasn't a bus driver and didn't even have a key for the bus, one point it shut off, and in the middle of all this pandemonium, we had to cross the wires to hot wire to get the bus rolling again. He didn't know we were supposed to go back to the embassy. Nobody knew what to do. He didn't know the city of Saigon, and we spent 3.5 hours just riding around the city looking for someone to get us somewhere, or someone who could tell us to do. He had radio contact with the mission warden's office, which supposedly was running the operation. They couldn't tell us what to do. At one point, they took us to a port facility near the downtown area of Saigon on the river, and the wagon master, which is the code name for the mission warden who was running the evacuation operation, said, "Leave us there." There was a crowd of about 3,000 Vietnamese there, some of them trying to get on boats to get out of the way. It was obvious that helicopters that we saw circling overhead at about 10,000 feet could not land there without any kind of defense perimeter, anyone there to maintain security. And there were what have been called the Saigon cowboys who were there, young toughs who were just running through the crowd trying to steal wallets from Americans and South Vietnamese who were trying to get out, snatching suitcases, wallets, passports, watches from people's wrists. So at that point, I decided that no one should remain there. We put everyone back on the bus, and we headed for the embassy. But once we got to the embassy, there was no way we could get in. There were thousands of people outside the U.S. Embassy, and they couldn't open the gates. So we ended up in a parking lot across the street from the embassy and made telephone contact, and we were directed to go around behind the embassy. So we had to walk through the crowds on 3 sides of the embassy and then down the street. And we ended up at what's known as the CRA compound, which is the back of the United States Embassy. And there was a crowd of perhaps 1,000 people standing on watching, and several hundred people right at the gates trying to climb over. There were 2 Marines on top pushing people back over. We had to fight our way through that crowd and then scale the wall. And once we were inside the compound, it was relatively easy.
Ed, thanks very much.